From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Most kids go through emotional and physical changes in middle school, but for Charlie Drinkwater, a 7th grader at Stevenson Middle School, the transformation goes far beyond the typical troubles of acne, fashion faux pas, and bad hair days. During his first period science class, Charlie suddenly morphs into a mutant dinosaur. Charlie discovers that he now has to confront the challenges of navigating everyday life as a dinosaur, while also finding out that the normal middle school problems of figuring out who he is, where he fits in, and who his friends are the same whether he is a boy or a beast. Bob Balaban, the author of the new book, The Creature from the 7th Grade, Boy or Beast, has said that Charlie is based on himself as a boy, presumably minus the scales and the tail. If that is true, then we need not worry about the Charlie Drinkwaters of the world, because they will grow up to make the planet a more intelligent, compassionate, and entertaining place. That is precisely what Bob Balaban has done during his impressive 40-year career. Many of you will recognize Bob Balaban for his work as an actor in movies and on television. Fans of Seinfeld will remember him as the NBC executive with an unfortunate obsession with Elaine, and came to a bad end. Among Balaban's films are Midnight Cowboy, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Capote, and several Christopher Guest films, including A Mighty Wind. In Gosford Park, he not only played the hilariously out-of-place Hollywood producer researching English country life, but behind the scenes was also a writer and a producer of the film. Balaban has produced or directed a number of films, including Bernard and Doris, about tobacco heiress Doris Duke. In addition to his work in the entertainment industry, Balaban has entertained young audiences with the McGrowls series for Scholastic, which follows the crime-solving adventures of Thomas and his bionic dog. And as the author of The Creature from the 7th Grade, he clearly remembers what it was like to be a 12-year-old boy trying to survive middle school, even with a long, scaly tail. So please join me in welcoming the multi-talented actor, director, producer, writer, and author, Bob Balaban.
Hello. I'm awfully glad you came out here today. It's a beautiful day. It's a little cold, but I'm sure we'll be fine. And basically, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself, how I came to be standing here today, which is sort of a circuitous path that I happen to take. And we're going to have questions if anybody has any. And in fact, feel free if anybody does while I'm talking want to know anything. Raise your hand, and I promise you I'll call on you. In fact, I'll be relieved you're asking a question. I didn't become a children's book writer on purpose. I've been in movies basically all my life since I was about 20 years old. And I branched off when I was about 35 because I began to realize I played basically doctors, psychiatrists, and teachers. And it was getting kind of boring. And I thought I better branch off pretty soon because I cannot do this for the rest of my life. I'll kind of go insane, happy though I am to be working whenever I'm working. At which point I started developing some things, movies and other things. And I came up with an idea about a little boy and his bionic dog, which I thought would make a swell movie. I still do think it might make a good movie. So if anybody out there wants to make a movie and has a few $1 million, give me a call and we'll figure something out. So I called Scholastic because Scholastic Publishing has a little movie division, and I submitted a treatment that I had written about this boy and his bionic dog. Well, they called back and they said, no, they didn't think it would make much of a movie, but they liked the treatment and they kind of needed a book that maybe young boys would be interested to read. Because as you possibly know, or you may not, it's easier to get young girls to read than it is to get young boys to read, typically, which is not to say that there aren't all sorts of exceptions, and hopefully you're one of them there, perhaps. I have a feeling. But it is difficult, and they thought the idea of a bionic dog would be appealing, and they said, the only thing is you've described him as a sort of this mutt mixture of a lot of different things. We need a golden retriever on the cover, because kids love golden retrievers. And I said, that's okay, we'll do that. So then they said, would I write 6 books Call It McGrowell, and we had a series from Scholastic, whose tent is right over there. And it did nicely, and I had a lot of fun writing this thing. Although I wrote one book before. I wrote the making of the movie book for a movie that I was in called Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which also happened by mistake. I had actually written a paper for school called Social Stratification on a Film Set. Typically, I did tend to get through school as quickly as I possibly could because I wanted to get on with my career. So I tended to take courses where I could make use of something I knew already and write about it. So in my sociology class, I came up with this idea that I would write about Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but not reveal the title. And I did. I wrote a 90-page dissertation on, essentially, depending on what rank you had, you got to get first in line for dinner, or you had to come to the set earlier or later. It was pretty stupid. And I was talking about it at a party one day, and there happened to be a gossip columnist at the party, and she wrote in her column that I had written this fabulous behind-the-scenes diary of the greatest movie ever made. And I got a call about 2 days later from 3 publishers, and we published my diary, which did not exist at the time. So I rented myself a room and an assistant who typed quickly, and I wrote my diary in about a week. And actually, 40 years later, you can still buy it. It's called Spielberg, Truffaut, and Me, The Adventures of a Small Actor in a Big Movie. But I didn't really intend to come to this writing thing, but McGraw was so much fun, and I used to get a lot of mail from my young readers. Because, you know, it's an odd thing to say, but you don't necessarily imagine that people are reading your book when you write it. You just sort of write your book and you send it out there, and you think about it, but not in terms of living, breathing people reading it. And I love getting my mail, and it reminded me that I was making, however insignificant, some small contribution to lives out there, that if they were entertained by a book, if it compelled them in some way, it would engage them and perhaps get them interested in reading. Now, which is not to say that I only did this altruistically. I liked writing books. But I got one letter that I will share with you that I so enjoyed, and I thought kids really take this seriously and fun, but serious. In my series, because it was aimed at kids 6 through 9 or 10, it was by nature repetitive. The first book was about a little boy who gets a bionic dog, which is all very exciting. Actually, he gets a regular dog who turns into a bionic dog. And then the story unfolds. There are 2 evil people who live in his little town, and they're out to destroy the world, one little town at a time. And it is up to the boy and his bionic dog to save the world. In the course of which the dog is kidnapped by the evil people, the boy and his little friend get the dog back, and life goes on, and it's all very silly and fun. And essentially, that's what happened in book 2, because it had to. In book 3, I tried to start at the end and work forward, sort of like a Harold Pinter play, perhaps. But by the end of book 3, I was getting a little tired of it. But it was doing well, and it sold well, so we had to continue. And I got a letter one day. A young 9-year-old girl wrote me and said, "Dear Mr. Balaban, I'm a little afraid to be writing you this letter. I think you may be angry with me. But I enjoyed your first book very much. I thought your second book was very interesting, and by the third book, I'm beginning to get bored. Where did your imagination go? I don't want you to be angry with me, but I feel as though I must express myself to you and say, wouldn't it be wonderful if you had a book where, and the dog did this, and the kids did that?" And again, and then she signed off and she said, "Again, I hope I'm not rude. I hope you don't mind my telling you this, but I thought you might want to know." So I sat down immediately. I was so excited that somebody actually took what I was writing so seriously that they were disturbed by it and they would write me a letter and talk to me about this. I was very, very excited. So I wrote her a letter and I said, "You wrote, I was so happy that you wrote to me and thought enough about my book to tell me what you really thought. I know it's very frightening to tell people things that you don't think they will be happy to hear, but I want you to know I loved hearing you tell the truth, and I hope you continue to do that." She was very excited, and she wrote back and told me she was working on a novel herself, and we had a little correspondence for a moment. And then I thought about it, and I went to Scholastic, and we were scheduled to do 6 books, and by now I was finishing my 5th book, and kind of going crazy. And I said, well, if it's really only 6 books, could I undo the formula at the end? Might the dog not be kidnapped by the evil monsters? In fact, might there be no evil monsters at all? A few interesting, suspicious characters, but nothing happens similar to the previous books. And actually, it turns out to be a book about the dog falling in love with another dog and starting a whole new family of super dogs that are little cute puppies. It really turned out nicely. So I dedicated the book to this little girl, wrote her a letter. I said, make sure you buy the last book. You know, you'll notice a little surprise in the beginning. And the feeling that I had actually affected one person's life in some small way was very exciting to me, and I thought, I must continue this. Needless to say, the girl eventually sent me her novel, well, at least the first 50 pages of it. This, by now she was 11, I guess. She was getting older. I don't know what became of her, but I hope that in some small way, I've nudged her a little bit along on a path that might be exciting and interesting for her. So I then sat down and I thought, it's been a while since I wrote a book. This is about 3 years ago, and I thought of a title. I thought of The Creature from the 7th Grade. I don't know why, actually, except as a child, I watched an endless succession of scary movies on television and then ended up sleeping in my parents' room a lot. But I loved these movies, and of course one was The Creature from the Black Lagoon. I also loved The Invisible Man, which I still to this day don't know why it's so frightening, at least to me, because nothing bad happens except he becomes invisible. As far as I know, he doesn't hurt anybody or sneak in anywhere where he shouldn't, but he is invisible, and I found that terrifying. So I decided that my book would be really a metaphor for adolescence, which, I can't say my adolescence was any rockier than anybody else's, but when you think about it, 7th grade is probably the largest transition that any of us will ever go through. We don't always think of it that way, but it's a mental achievement. Suddenly you have hours and hours of homework where before you had to color things in and make maps and do some other things. I mean, with some variation, accompanied by an enormous, exciting, terrifying physical transformation that nobody usually really tells you very much about until you wake up one day and discover that you have a mustache, which is really very surprising, and it was to me anyway. I wasn't expecting any of this. So I thought, all right, well, Charlie Drinkwater will be me, this skinniest, shortest boy in his class who plays no sports because he's afraid basically that he'll get killed, which almost happened to me. And in fact, so I wrote a book about a little boy who is me, who instead of transforming into a regular old adolescent, transforms into an 8.5-foot mutant reptile and has to cope with the same issues that everybody else does, only they're bigger. You may have felt like you had a tail and scales and gill slits. Charlie really has them, but he still has to cope with life because people are a little surprised at first when they see him, but then he just goes back to being Charlie Drinkwater. The problem of the first book, this is the cover and thing, the problem with Charlie for the first book, he and his 2 little friends who are having a perfectly fine time being interested in science and math and all the other things that they're interested in, he and his friends are not popular. And for the first time in their life, one of the 3 of them is intensely popular. The boys think he's going to be great at sports, and the girls think he's kind of scary and cool and dangerous. So he has a momentary flurry of invitations to things, and he gets to find out, for the middle of the book, what it's like to live in the fast lane. He goes to parties, he stays up late, he does things. It turns out that they don't do anything at all but sit around and do what he and his friends do, which is a kind of an interesting shock for him. And by the end of the book, he goes back to realizing what his true values are, which is be with your friends who love you. Don't hang around with people just because they think you're cool or they think you're cool, because being cool isn't exactly all that it's cracked up to be. So I wrote my book. It came out last week, and I'm here today. And essentially, I have always been interested in telling stories of some kind. Probably it's a little bit genetic, although nobody else in my family too much has this interest. But my family was in the movie business 8 million years ago. And in 1908, the year my father was born, his family went into the Nickelodeon business. My grandparents lived in a slum in Chicago that was the Lower East Side ghetto, chic by jowl, with a bunch of other people in the slum, many of whom ended up being very interesting, well-known people. Benny Goodman was their neighbor, very famous band leader and musician. Hyman Rickover was right on the next door, and Bill Paley, William Paley, who started CBS, was their other neighbor. And they all had little grocery stores. My family had a delicatessen that was doing very badly, and nobody was doing. Jack Ruby lived there, who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. So it was a very odd and eclectic bunch of people. Well, my grandmother was very tired of being in the delicatessen business because things weren't going too well. My grandfather was very nice, but he let everybody buy on credit, and at the end of the month, it was impossible to get paid. And there was a lot of waste. You know, the lettuce was always wilting, and you just threw it away, and you were wasting a lot of money. So she happened to go to a Nickelodeon, the new thing. You went behind a curtain. It wasn't much. It was, 20 times smaller than this thing, and you watched a 3-minute movie of some kind. And she said, there were 8 brothers. My dad was 1 at the time. She said, we're going into the movie business. It's the business of the future. There's no waste. When the movie gets old, you send it back and get a new one, and you pay your nickel before you go in. There's no credit. So it was like the perfect business. 20 years later, they had 75 theaters sprinkled around the Midwest, mostly in the Chicago area, and built a theater called the B&K Uptown that sat more people than Radio City Music Hall. They were designed to be fantastic. They were filled with European antiques, and the idea was you were going into a new and amazing world. You were supposed to feel as though this was not your regular life. It was special to go into one of the theaters, and it kind of got you in the mood for the fantasy that would await you. So really, in a way, if you think about it, a book is kind of like a private movie. I mean, you're the only one reading it at the time, but when you're in your book, you're in a private world. You can escape your life, you can amplify your life, you can learn about your life, but you really, for the time being, in a way, enter even a more fantastic world than movies do, because you get to see it as you read it, and you can see whatever you want to see. A movie actually shows you what it is. I actually got very, very hooked on movies when I was about 10, because my uncle ran a movie studio. He ran Paramount Pictures for a number of years, and he was the Balaban of a theater chain called Balaban and Katz. The Katz of Balaban and Katz went to California and ran the musical division at MGM and produced a lot of the big musicals in Hollywood, most of which were before I was born, but some of which, like Singing in the Rain and some other terrific movies, he produced. And when I was 10, I got to California to visit my grandparents. I didn't really know what they did. Nobody talked about it particularly, and I didn't really understand what was going on. So I arrived at the studio and was taken in to a film set for the first time in my life. And it was quite astonishing. It was a movie called Meet Me in Las Vegas, starring Sid Charisse and Dan Daly. It's on television every once in a while. It's not a great movie. But I walked in, and they had created perfectly a Las Vegas gambling casino, a gigantic thing with 400 extras and gambling tables and beautiful women, and Sid Charisse was there, and she was quite amazing. I had broken my arm, and she signed my cast. I tried to keep it forever, and I have a picture, Sid Charisse on my cast, but you can't keep a cast. It's too unpleasant. You don't really want to keep it around. And there I was in front of this fake world. There were cars outside the set, but inside the building, driving around outside, and you really felt when they yelled action and 400 extras were screaming and yelling, hit me, and the things, and the roulette wheel was going. And then they yelled cut, and it all was quiet, and everybody stood there, and that was it for the rest of my life. I didn't tell anybody then, and I didn't really make a conscious decision, but all that I wanted to do after that was make puppet shows. So I started with puppet shows. I became an actor when I was about 18 or 19 years old. I moved to New York. I happened to be Linus in the original Your Good Man, Charlie Brown, sort of setting the mold for if anybody needed to find somebody who looked like they were intelligent for a part, I got the job. Notice I didn't say I was intelligent. I looked like I was intelligent. There's a really big difference there. And I began my career and continue it. I'm very happy doing what I do. I have branched off. I directed a television movie, which I don't know if anybody saw, with Susan Sarandon and Ray Fiennes about Doris Duke and her butler. That was great fun that we got on. I did a Georgia O'Keeffe project with Joan Allen and Jeremy Irons. And I produced and was in a movie that I just loved called Gosford Park, which we mentioned before. Thank you. Which was a lot of fun. And all of these things came about because I was sitting alone in my room going, what can I create that I could possibly turn into a job for myself? So now I'm creating this, and there will be 3 more of them. And I would love, I mean, I have more things I will talk about, but I would love if anybody has a question about absolutely anything. I would love it if they would ask a question. We'll have a little question moment here. Oh, yeah. I can't say, oh, it's actually a little scary. You have to go to a microphone, but you're coming there. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to thank you for your years of art, talent, and humor. I mean,
Oh, thank you.
I think for a lot of people, and for myself for several years, you're always one of those characters that were really interesting, but it's like, who is that?
Yeah, that's the story of my life.
We know, yeah, but we know now. We do. And can you talk just for a few minutes about Exonerated?
Oh, thank you for asking. About 15 years ago, I directed a play, which I occasionally do in New York. It was a fine play. It wasn't terribly successful. And a young actor in the play, about 6 months later, came up to me and said, my girlfriend and I were doing some research. We attended a conference about people who were on death row who were innocent, which doesn't happen often, but it does happen enough so that there is a category of people called exonerated. They had come back from a trip. They had interviewed 40 different people, mostly men, a couple of women, who had spent up to 22 years on death row for crimes they didn't commit. And I went, oh, maybe, I don't know, what is this? They said, well, we thought it could be a play of some kind. So I read these stories, and they were all just unbelievably fascinating stories. Because first of all, we're all sort of interested in crime and resolution and the intricacies of how somebody is determined to be guilty or innocent. I find it fascinating. But what leapt out at me when I read the 45 stories was the personalities of the people involved were so diverse and so interesting. And we whittled down the 45 cases to 6 cases. It was important to us that the cases all be apparently very, very innocent people, in many cases proven by DNA, and in other cases proven because people had actually confessed to the crime who weren't the people who were spending the time in prison. So we whittled it down to 6 people and created an evening, which I will describe to you a little bit, which we've just opened this evening again off-Broadway with some wonderful actors. Stockard Channing is in it this week, Brian Dennehy, Chris Sarandon, and a wonderful actor named Delroy Lindo. So we made a docudrama out of the thing. The 6 people we found all had amazing voices. So right away they were like beautiful poetry, these things. Sometimes painful poetry, sometimes very, very surprisingly inspiring poetry that they were saying when they talked about their lives. So we met the 6 people, we interviewed them extensively, and then we went back and got court documents. We got their confessions. In many cases, there were forced confessions for these crimes. And we investigated their confessions from the point of view of the prosecution and the defense. How did this happen? What did the prosecution think they were doing? What did the defense think was happening? It's very hard for us to understand as an audience, so to speak, how it is that somebody could actually admit that they did something as terrible as killing somebody. Why would you ever do that? So part of our evening was to sort of explain how that would happen. But more than anything, we really wanted to tell the stories of 6 people that could have been any of us here. Because none of us think it could ever happen to them, and these people didn't either. And we did a 95-minute summation that feels like a play. You find out from the 6 different people what they supposedly did, what happened to them, how they ended up in prison, what it was like being in prison, and then how did they get out, and what are their lives now. And I never would have thought it would have been entertaining. I just thought it was important that these people have their stories be told. And it's very healing for them to have their stories told. All of them have come to the theater on more than one occasion and listened to 200 people gasping when they hear what happened to them. It's very reaffirming to them because, they've been through a lot and they really need affirmation in a lot of cases. And it turned out to be entertaining, oddly enough. I mean, define entertaining. There are laughs in it because some of the people are funny when they talk about their stories. And it's also very satisfying to experience with these people in a very shorthand way what they went through. And now I'm talking too long and I'll stop. But we are running off Broadway. If anybody feels like seeing it, I hope you'll come at the Culture Project. We have wonderful people. Brooke Shields is coming in next week. Lyle Lovett will be there the week after that. And every week, Marty Short is actually going to come and play a very serious part, which he likes to do. He's not only funny. So there we are. I kept looking at you and thinking you were telling me to wind it up. It's over. Stop talking now. But no. Next question.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
I just wanted to say I very much enjoy your work in A Mighty Wind.
Oh,
and,
thank you.
Along that line, could you talk to us a little bit about how the work on the stage compares and contrasts with your work with Christopher Guest?
Yes, can I add, and I'll add another little thing to that too. The world of Christopher Guest, for anybody who, it's not a large audience, but the people who see these movies love these movies, and actually the people who are in these movies love them too. The first one we did was called Waiting for Guffman. Has anybody seen that movie? I don't know. Good. Well, I didn't know what I was getting into, but I did know Christopher. We had worked together in a movie years ago, and he called and he said, come be in the movie. There's no script. We start on Tuesday. And I said, sure. What do I have to do? And he said, well, you're the musical director, and you have to play the piano. How well do you play the piano? And I said, not at all, but I can learn by Tuesday. So I really did. I couldn't, though. I tried to. And then Christopher said, well, it's improvised. We'll just make up another character who will be your assistant who plays the piano for you. So we went and did that movie, and I had, the funnest time I have ever had in my life. I had studied improvisation by mistake when I was 15 years old. A friend of mine was in a teenage workshop at the Second City in Chicago, which is the home of improvisation, basically. A wonderful woman named Viola Spallin, who wrote a book that if anybody's interested, you should read, called Theater Games, or Games for the Theater. And I learned a great amount and realized it unleashed in me something that I didn't really know was there, which is something I could actually do rather well. And I wasn't used to doing things too well at that point. So now I'm in Waiting for Guffman, and I discover that by not knowing anything except who you are and where you're going, and you show up, it's a relief. I don't really like talking in front of people very much, but I really don't like, for a long time, I didn't like memorizing things and then having to say them and trying to figure out who I was. In improvising, to a large extent, you are very much who you are on some level, and it's not like work, it's like play, and I love to play, which is why I like to write, because to me, when it's going well, writing is like playing. So these improvised movies sort of help you unlock your inner writer, is actually what it is. Although the rule is you do not write. You don't sit there and say to yourself, what would be funny? Where should I come from? How will this go over? You actually just exist as you do in your real life. And when it happens well, it's quite fun and exciting, and it's great to watch the other people. And my wife is a writer, and I've always wondered, do you turn on a switch? What's it like when you sit down? Do you think about it first and then write it? Well, you do a lot of thinking about a lot of things, and then you do exactly what, or at least I do, what I do in the Christopher Guest movies, which is I know where I'm going, I know where I came from, and I know vaguely what's happening right now. And then I wait, and I sit there, and I wait for this thing to start talking that isn't me exactly. But it is me, of course, but it's not me trying to make something. It's me really just trying to exist, which is a lot of fun, and that's why the movies are so much fun. So we had a great time doing the four of them. My work on stage is completely different, you could say, from the Christopher Guest movies, because it's using a different part of your brain extremely. But I do find that being a writer and a director and a producer is very helpful, because by seeing things from so many different points of view, it really sharpens your perceptions and teaches you an awful lot about working and about human beings and about whatever it is you're doing. So I like my multiple perspective. It's very satisfying to me. Does anybody else have a thought or a question about anything? Did anybody see the movie Moonrise Kingdom? Has anybody seen that movie? Anybody who hasn't, if he hasn't, are you 12? I bad at ages. 10. No, the person behind you. No, I didn't think you were 12, I promise. And I won't embarrass you by talking about you too much. But I think he's probably old enough. This is a movie about 12-year-olds, basically. And it's also a movie, if you pay attention to it, it's a movie about literature. Because one of the stars of the movies is a 12-year-old girl who lives and escapes from her very difficult life by reading fantasy books that tend to be about empowering young women. And she gets to live out in the movie her greatest fantasy, which is to run away and have an adventure and change her life. So really, books are what causes this whole movie. In fact, there are 6 books mentioned in the movie, and I actually did a fake commercial for the 6 books. I thought they were real books. I had no idea. They were all of them so beautifully designed and illustrated that we actually did a commercial and had a couple of minutes of animated footage about each of these books that don't even exist. But anyway, it's a wonderful movie. I got to be the narrator, which is sort of like being the writer, you could say, in something like this. And it was a lot of fun, but I just wondered if people had read it. Because to me, that's the audience for, something like this, more or less, is the same audience for that movie. Yeah. Would this book be appropriate for the 4th grade? Yeah, I think you're 10 in 4th grade, because you're 9 in 4th grade. You add 5 because you're 5 when you start. Absolutely, I think 9 is great. I think there would never be anything in these books that you wouldn't want a young person to read about. I was very careful. And one of the things I learned with McGraw and then relearned with Creature from the 7th grade, these books are very carefully aimed at their audience. And it's not a young adult book. This is for young readers. They're just at the cusp of dating, but dating is not a focus of these things. Yes, it's social, and there's a lot about popularity and what it's like to be on the inside and on the outside. But there really isn't anything that's inappropriate. Would it be fun for a 6 or a 7-year-old? 10 minutes. Wow, the time flew. That's just amazing. Thank you. I was so scared of 45 minutes. I thought, is it 6 minutes yet? I mean, how many more minutes do we have to go? I have other stories to tell, but they're running out. So that hopefully any kid who looks at the cover and says, "Oh, that looks interesting," probably it would be appropriate for them. 5 or 6. Probably a little boring for them, maybe. But I hope you do buy it, and I hope everybody does. Is somebody bursting to ask a question of some kind? Yes. Oh yeah, mention the project about Georgia O'Keeffe, sure. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing next, because why not? You're a captive audience, and my family doesn't really want to hear, so I may as well make you listen to this. I was approached a couple years ago. Some people had developed a movie about Georgia O'Keeffe. It was really the love story between Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, her mentor and husband, eventually. And I knew about Georgia O'Keeffe. I knew she was an important painter. I knew her work. But I didn't know much about her personal life other than she was a renegade. That I knew, because there are famous pictures of her at the age of 80 riding a motorcycle and looking like a wild person, which she was, kind of. Joan Allen was Georgia O'Keeffe. She's a wonderful actress. If you don't know her, you should, and you probably know her anyway. Jeremy Irons played Alfred Stieglitz, who was the brilliant photographer who started a gallery at the turn of the century in Lower Manhattan, or actually eventually on Madison Avenue in the 50s. that imported. Every great artist at the turn of the century was introduced to America by this one man. He was just an amazingly intelligent, prescient gallery owner. Picasso had his first exhibit here. Matisse and an awful lot of other people were imported by Stieglitz. In fact, after his first Picasso exhibit, nobody bought one. And he bought one himself because he was so embarrassed to return all of these things to Picasso and having to say, gee, nobody wants your work. They're not interested in it. We did it for the Lifetime Network, which was a radical departure for them. We had started at HBO, and for whatever reason, they decided not to do it. So we did it at Lifetime, and I must say they were, in the end, very supportive, although we did get some notes like, they're not kissing enough, you know, and stuff like that. But they were actually very passionate people, Georgia and Alfred, so we added like one kiss, but it was fine. What is the title? It's called Georgia O'Keeffe. But you may have a hard time finding it. They don't rerun it ever. And I had a great time making it. Mostly I learned a lot about a great artist that I didn't know very much about. Read a lot of her letters to... In the days of corresponding, because I think it's about to say a minute and a half or something, but we live in a world now that's so fast. Everything is, we tweet and we're always interrupting whatever we're doing to say, yes, I'm eating now, but you're eating and you don't really have to tell anybody. And it's corny and old-fashioned to say it, but our attention spans are just shorter and shorter. So reading suffers because of this. We read shorter things. We don't have the kind of... We're not interested in the kind of detail that we used to. And letter writing suffers terribly. And in fact, most of the correspondence these days is electronic correspondence, which will not be preserved. So when you think about it, an awful lot... Yes, you have a question. Hello.
Hello. Back to 7th grade.
7th grade, okay.
I'm a retired middle school librarian.
Oh, wow, okay.
And I want to thank you for writing a book that has a character in 7th grade because they're few and far between.
Oh.
And yes, it is the most awkward year of middle school, absolutely. So I guess my question would be, will the follow-up books also take place in 7th grade, or will they be like Diary of a Wimpy Kid, where every year is a different year?
No. In Creature of the 7th grade, every book is a different week.
Better. That's great.
Doesn't it feel like it took 4 years to get through 7th grade?
Absolutely.
Well, it really will
And as
take.
a teacher of 7th grade.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you.
Much needed.
It's a lot of fun, and as I say, it's every time I'm stuck, I think of something that happened to me in 7th grade. I was this big and weighed 1.5 pounds, and my principal, who happened to be my homeroom advisor in 7th grade, decided that all the boys were going to have to be on the football team. He made football mandatory, and I'm like, excuse me, sir, I don't think so. And I engaged in a ruinous discussion with the principal, thinking nothing about it. I would never do anything like that as an informed adult. Don't disagree with authority. Write a secret letter or something. But I did, and he hated me for the rest of the year. Well, Charlie, in the second book, called Sink or Swim, is forced to be on the swimming team, which is horrifying for him because even though he's an amphibious monster, he's afraid of the water and must conquer his fear of the water. So I'm always looking for something that actually happened to me because I'll actually know something about it. And I did feel like a monster, so that worked. 5 minutes. Well, yes. The movie about the girl in the books, which I will say it 3 times, it's so good. If it's out on DVD, rent it. It's called Moonrise Kingdom. And it's a fabulous movie with a title that's impossible to remember. Nobody ever, I had to sit here and go, what's the title of the movie? I didn't quite remember it. Moonrise Kingdom. Bill Murray, Bruce Willis, Frances McDormand, Edward Norton, and Jason Schwartzman, and me. It's really fun. I mean, you'll really enjoy it. But I'm so glad you came here. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry I didn't have... Thank you. I'm not really an author. I'm just a person struggling to get by. So it's really exciting to come to Washington and see these tents that make everything look so fun and interesting with such an accumulation of actually intelligent people who don't seem like they're intelligent. I've only been here for a minute and a half, and I'm having a great time. So have a great time. Enjoy your stay here in Intelligent World. And thank you. It was really nice to see you all.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.